Hi, my name is John Nord. I want to do a several part series on how I make my spurs, and I have a order for a pair of spurs called the Marfa Shanks, and these are a unique spur. This particular model was made famous by Swede Strong or Harold Strong in the 30s and 40s. To make these spurs, I'm going to use a 1/4 inch thick piece of 1018 steel. A lot of times I use 4130, but I'm using 1018 today. And I'll be using brass patterns to mark the bands out. This part is going to cover the band. This is my pattern. The shank is a unique shank. It kind of goes up and over, and it's a little bit more difficult to build, but I like doing them. I've done several of these. This is what it's going to kind of look like, and it's got a 1.5 inch 24-point rowel. First of all, what I'll be doing is I'll be marking this pattern off on this piece of steel, and then we'll get it cut out. And I use this die-chem steel blue coating to put on my steel so I can see my trace mark once I put it on here. Okay, I've got the steel coated with the die-chem. I think my die-chem's old because it usually turns out a real blue solid color. But anyway, I got it on here, and I scribe around it with a scribe, and you want to carefully do this and make sure it's deep enough. And also mark the swinger slots and the holes for the hangers. I've got a hole here in the center that I mark, and it'll be used in assembly. Anyway, scribe all the way around it, and it looks pretty good on here. Okay, I start cutting this out on my bandsaw. I stay right outside the lines so I have enough room to fall back to the line. Okay, I'm cutting down this other side of the band, and it's a slow process. It's 1/4 inch steel, so it cuts a little slower, but I like using 1/4 inch because I taper my bands to the front, and this gives me room to taper them and to get a good polish on them. After I do that, I start cutting down cut the hanger slots out. I'm cutting down one side of the hanger slot. And then once I get both sides cut, I start cutting across the bottom, and I try to get it just outside the line to get these bottoms cut out, and that way I'll be able to get them filed down with not too much trouble. This shows the slot, and I'll just file through the bottom like this, and it'll come out real nice. Then I start cutting down the other side of the band. I cut the curved ends. Okay, I start cutting the other hanger slot out and across the bottom. It takes a couple of cuts to get these done. A little bit of detail right here. Then I cut across the other curved end. Like I say, I stay right outside the line so you can fall back to the line. And that's got this one. One more to go. Okay, I've got both these bands cut out, and they both look pretty good. They match up to the pattern real close. We've got room to file them back down to the lines. I just secure them in the vise to start with. You always want to leave you a little room around that line when you cut them out, because you have to have room to follow them back to the line and get them straightened up and flat. And you want to make sure that you keep that file flat across the top. And you always file in one direction like this. That's the cutting direction of the file, and that keeps it nice and flat and straight. About to finish this one up here. Get it out and look at it. Looks pretty good. Clean your file up with a file brush, keep the filings out of them. And last thing I do is I put both the bands in a vise, match them up. Sometimes on the ends especially, you have to do a little bit more filing to get them exactly the same. And I just file over the curve. I do the same thing all over on the two bands to make sure they both match exactly. Get them out and look at them here. These look like they matched up really well. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to center punch the hanger holes. There's 4 hanger holes, and I carefully center punch right in the center of the circles I marked with the pattern. And I also center punch the center hole, which is used in assembly. It'll keep this band centered up in my bending jig. I'll drill these holes on my press here in a minute. I'll also mark the inside of the band off the center of the back with a maker's stamp. This will identify them as a pair of spurs I made. I think this is real important if you make spurs. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drill these center punched holes for the hangers. I start out with a 1/8 inch bit. Some people use a 1/16. They're a lot more delicate. And there's 4 holes I'm going to drill out and a center hole. I switch over to the 3/16 bit for the final hole, which is the size of the hangers and also the size of the pin that I'm going to put in the center of the band that will fit into my bended jig. And you just want to go through these carefully, make sure you get them a good hole right where they need to be, because they're pretty important. That takes care of that. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is taper my bands. I was taught by Wilson Capron, and he always tapers his bands from thick at the back to thinner at the front. The strength in your band is at the back by the shank, and the front being thinner will make for a more comfortable spur, is the way he taught me, and I've always done this. It's a little more difficult. A lot of spur makers don't do this step. They just leave them thick all the way. I use a 12-inch disc sander, and I've made a little table on the front of it to allow for clamping of this piece of angle iron at a slant. I've got yellow marks here to where I'm going to leave it full thickness in that area, and then it's going to be 1/8 inch, or it'll come out probably a little thicker than 1/8 inch at the front, because I got to allow for polishing down and everything. I don't want to get too thin. And take this piece of angle, I put a full thickness off the disc at the middle of the band, and then I use a piece of 1/8 inch steel to put it about 1/8 inch off of the disc towards the front of the band. And you have to clamp these angle iron on real tight with C-clamps, and I'll show you the slant here on it. And that will allow for the tapering of the band as I feed it in. Okay, I'm getting ready to taper this band. You want to wear gloves and a mask and a full face shield. Things can go wrong and you can hurt an eye or a finger or something. I wanted to say you always taper the outside of the band. You don't want to taper the inside. Use vice grips on the end of it to hold it more secure, and you just slowly feed it in here, back and forth, and once it turns a little color you need to put it in some water. You don't want to get it red hot. You want to keep the heat off of it as much as possible, and you got to cool it pretty regular. This is pretty time consuming. It takes a while to do this because you have to feed it fairly slow. It helps a lot if your disc is in good shape. Mine's pretty well worn here. Okay, we got this thing tapered. It's about full thickness in there in the back and a little bit over 1/8 inch at the front, and that's how you do it. Okay, the next thing we're going to do, we've got the bands tapered to the right thickness, and this is the outside of the band. What we're going to do is put a mark right in here, halfway of the thickness of the band. And over here too, halfway the thickness of the band. Okay, then we're going to put the band in here in the vise, and we're going to take the smaller file, and we're going to file back this halfway to a 45-degree angle. That's going to allow our swingers to go up flush with the outside and still turn back and forth. If you don't cut that angle, your swingers will hang up. They won't turn. So we're going to cut that down into a 45-degree angle. And you need to do that on all 4 slots. The 45 goes to the outside of the band. I'm holding the file at a 45. Okay, you can see that 45 I cut on there. That's going to allow that swinger to move back and forth and not catch the outside edge of this. And you do that on all the slots. Okay, now that I have the slots cut, we're going to take a countersink bit, or that's what I call it, and we're going to go to the back side of the band, which is this side, the flat side, and we're going to countersink these holes, these 4 holes, 1, 2, 3, 4, not the center hole, because that's used for assembly, but these will have the swingers riveted into them. So they need a countersink for that flare to sink into. Kind of like that. Just where you see maybe a 1/16 of a rim around that hole, maybe a little less. You can see there. And I'll do the other band too. Okay, next, before I go to bending the band, I'm going to clean up the inside of it on my belt sander, and I'm going to start off with a 80 grit, and we'll see what kind of scratches in it. If they're not too deep, I'll go to a 120. This way, when the band's bent in a U shape, it's hard to get in there and clean it up other than just simply polishing it. You can on a belt sander like this. I can take this fence here off and go around like that, but it tends to round it also. So I'm going to flatten the inside up real nice and clean before I bend it. I have a video on making this particular belt sander, which was originally designed by Bruce Cheney. I've done a few changes to it, but it's worked real good for me. You might check out my video on building this. Clean it up pretty nice. Got a few tips in here that I got to get out, and then we'll be good. Okay, this is the part of spur building that I get the most of. How do you bend your spur bands? I have a jig that I made, and I have a female die and a male die, and this is the men's size. I have a lady size and I have a kid's size, and those are general sizes. You have to measure the boot to know exactly what you need, but this gets them into a real close measurement with what you need, and then you can adjust them from there at a further stage to get that right width at the mouth of the spur to fit the customer's boot. Okay, there's a lot of ways to bend spur bands. Every spur maker has his own way. I was taught by Wilson Capron, which is one of the better spur makers, if not the best. I'm partial to him, I guess. And he had a jig like this, and what he did is he heated his bands up to in a forge to red hot. He put them in this, he put the male up there, and he had a press with a lever that he could pull down one swipe and have them bent. And then he would hold them there a minute, let them cool off, take them out. They were ready to go. They didn't spring back or anything. My press is hydraulic. It's not that fast. It takes a while to get down and bend the spur band. So I have to bend my spur bands cold. And then when I take them out of this jig, they spring out some. So then I have to put them on another jig, heat them up, clamp them down and let them cool that way. So I'll show you that process, but this is the way I bend my spur bands. First of all, I take this and I grease my jig so it don't scar the spur up too bad. It will scar it up some anyway. It's pretty hard on them right here at the top. And I also grease the band like that. On my male jig, I have a 3/16 pin that is staked into a hole on the back of this. You can see why I have the hole in the spur band in the center. That centers it up on my bending jig when I go to bend it. So, next step is to put it on here. Make sure you have the outside down, which would be the tapered side. Make sure you have it centered up on the jig like so, both ends even, and make sure you're pretty much centered up on your jack or your press. I'm going to bring this down. Okay, now I'm going to look at my spur band, make sure I got it the same. And while you're bending it, you have to watch it and make sure it stays centered up. If it starts moving out past the jig, you got to stop and center it back up. Okay, at this point I'm out of ram, so I'm going to raise this up and go ahead and press it the rest of the way. Okay, it's pressed flush up to the die, so I don't need to press it on down to the bottom. The completion of the bending will take place over here on another jig I have with some heat, and I'll show you that in a minute. This is the spur band that we haven't bent, haven't finished yet. It just came out of the press over there, and you can see it's pretty wide. This is my customer's foot, or spur size, and you can see it sprung out too far. This one I've already done the final step on, and it's pretty darn close. It's a little bit narrow up here at the front, but when I go welding this shank on, it's going to pull that out some. So I think it'll be just right, but if not, I can adjust it a little bit without heat and all. So I'm going to show you how I get this to the finished one. Another thing I wanted to tell you is when you cold bend these, they get a warp, or not a warp, but a dish in them in the sides like this. And I will take this after I get it bent to this stage here, and I'll work it on my belt sander and get that all smooth and round where it's flat surface all the way around, and it'll take these little scars out here and all that. So that's another step in finishing up the band, actually the last step, before you can go welding it together and things like that. But the last thing I'm going to show you is how I get this one to a finished being like this. And I'm going to take this and I've got, this is another jig I have that's similar to this one, except it's got a hollowed out inside to where I can clamp to it. And I just line the hole up on my center mark back here, and I'm going to clamp this down real tight. I'm not too worried about it getting scarred up back here because I've got to do a lot of sanding on it anyway, especially after putting the shank on. So I don't use anything to protect it there. You want them really tight so they don't move on you. Like that. One on each side of the center. Okay, now you can see I just got to move these in. So what I'm going to do is heat them up with a torch, and then I'm going to take this aluminum punch and I'm going to tap it until I see that it's at where I want it. And then we'll let it cool. I'll let this cool off, and then I'll get it over there on the belt sander and get those sides cleaned up. We're going to, I think this will be about a 4-part series. Part 2, we'll be cutting the shanks out and filing them to fit this Marfa shank style spur. And we might get to welding them on in that part, or it might be in a part 3, but just follow along and you'll see how this whole set of spurs are built. Thanks for tuning in.